from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. Welcome to our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. And I'm going to kind of switch gears. Is there a lot going on in Iran, the Middle East? You bet. Is there a lot going on in a lot of places? You bet. But I'm going to kind of bring it closer to home. And one of the reasons is because there is strategic opportunity with what's going on in the Western Hemisphere. And I want to allude to that. I think there's some real opportunities in terms of doing business, particularly with minerals, oil, but also with other resource issues coming from the Western Hemisphere, Central South America, the Caribbean, elsewhere. A lot of changes, a lot of things well beyond the headlines. And I'm going to kind of get into that. So I'm going to talk about what's happening here, talk about how this is really dramatically changing the security landscape on a macro sense. And then also, by extension, how this is changing some of the economic and business reality of doing business in Latin America, which is Central, South America, and the Caribbean, and really the Western Hemisphere across the whole. First off, the U.S. is now engaged in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly what the area of responsibility of what's called U.S. Southern Command or SOUTHCOM, Caribbean, Central America, South America, Latin America, in ways that we just haven't seen in many, many decades. All right. It's a huge change. And you may recall last year, earlier in the Trump administration, the president had talked about taking back the canal zone in Panama, that the U.S. would reassert sovereignty. Of course, he was saying this at the same time he was talking about the U.S. should take sovereignty over Greenland. So a lot of controversy in the news, a lot of discussion on Greenland and what's the U.S. doing. And certainly that has caused some real hard feelings with some of our NATO partners because Greenland is part of Denmark. But what kind of happened in Panama was interesting. First, the president down there was a little nonplussed. He's very pro-American, went to college in the U.S. He wasn't quite sure why the U.S. was saying that. And so there began negotiations with Panama in earnest. And one of the things that we had cited very publicly was Chinese influence down there. Part of it was Chinese influence in the construction of a bridge going across the canal zone, or going across the canal, I should say. And then the other thing was talking about these two ports, these two big port facilities, port areas on each end of the canal in the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans that were owned by a Hong Kong company. Very prominent Hong Kong company, which is a Chinese company that does stuff all over the world. But it was brought up that China had these two strategic positions on each end of the canal zone, and how strategic the canal zone was to the U.S. Navy, but also to U.S. commerce, all the stuff that we move back and forth through the canal. And the fact, I don't know, but certainly the president was talking about that the Navy was not getting what he considered a fair consideration for providing or signing over the canal zone back to Panama when we did back in the late 90s, that we were not first in line, so to speak, in moving our ships back and forth. And this was absolutely critical to us from a strategic position. Anyway, long story short, that was the backdrop of what became this discussion on Panama. All right. Well, we did end up taking over the canal zone. But that Hong Kong-owned company, that Chinese company that owned those port facilities, basically got forced out. Now, they're fighting it in court. They've got international lawyers working on this. There's a consortium of companies, U.S. ownership is prominent amongst them, which are looking at going in there to take over the facility. But the Panamanian Supreme Court even stepped in and said that this Chinese company can't own these areas. So it really went to the highest level of law within Panama. So we'll see what comes out of this. But that quickly changed. Another thing that happened was that the U.S. military is back in the canal zone. We're actually doing training at Fort Sherman, and there is talk that the U.S. may actually establish a more permanent footprint within the canal zone, what used to be the U.S. canal zone area, that we may reestablish the stuff, looking at some of the bases down there. I was stationed down there. I could tell you we had a huge Air Force base, a huge air base down there. We had significant naval facilities. Of course, the Army was down there in a major way that goes back literally to when we first went into Panama. So it was really almost a throwback to another era when I was there in the mid-90s. And so it's looking like the U.S. presence is really going back into Panama. And from what I can understand, we've kind of resolved the issue of Navy ships, precedence of order going through the canal zone. So that appears they're getting what would probably be preferential treatment, which is something that we kind of demand as part of the treaty that we have with Panama. So that has really changed a lot. So that's Panama. Complete turnaround from where we were. Well, not complete turnaround, but a big turnaround from where we were, say, a year ago. Venezuela. Obviously, if you go back to the beginning of the year, pretty spectacular U.S. raid capturing Nicolas Maduro, the president, some would say not legitimate president, but the president, de facto president of Venezuela. And then within 24 hours, running him off to a jail and a court in New York City. That was simply stunning, what took place there. An amazing military operation, amazing raid. And then not complete regime change, but we came to terms, for lack of a better term, so to speak, with his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. And what's been kind of quietly happening, President Trump says we're taking control of Venezuela, we're doing all this other stuff. Well, we essentially blockaded Venezuelan oil from getting out of there. So we took de facto control by the fact they couldn't export or import anything without a USA because of our naval presence there. And so we've kind of come to terms with what is essentially the Maduro, what's left over of the Maduro regime, and we're working out things, and it's been fascinating to watch this. In fact, in I think it was May 20th, that the White House put out a video highlighting recent U.S.-Venezuela mineral agreements, which are pretty extensive, and they're being executed over the last few months. Well beyond oil, we're talking about gold, we're talking about a lot of other things there. So really something that's got a lot of attention in terms of how this is shifting our presence in Venezuela, but how that also shifts our influence in South America, but particularly along the Caribbean and particularly the northern part of South America, where Venezuela had been just an absolute thorn in our side, an anti-American base, if you will, that was influencing, threatening its neighbors, threatening to invade and take over most of Guyana right next door. And Guyana has a huge offshore oil capability there, or oil field that they're developing, and doing a lot of things. All right. So since January, the Trump administration has recognized the interim government led by Delcy Rodriguez, has opened up this natural resources to the United States, and these deals are worth potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. This is enormous. And so a real turnaround in what's happening in Venezuela. Now, I think we've opened our embassies up again. So a lot of things going on there. And ExxonMobil is still trying to figure out, what can they do down there? But they do have teams, as I saw, as I was prepping for this today, that they have a team or teams down in Venezuela trying to figure out, can they take managerial control of those oil fields? And you may remember that under Chavez and Maduro, they kicked out the U.S. oil companies, and then they brought them back in. They kicked them out again. And so there's a lot of issues to be resolved there. A lot of money, billions and billions and billions of U.S. investment that was essentially seized, nationalized by Chavez and Maduro, that now has to be reconciled. So we're going to see what comes out of that. All right. One thing in the news a lot is Cuba. All right. Not the least of which has been President Trump says, well, we may have to just take control of Cuba. Well, there's a lot packed into that phrase. Just for reference, Cuba's pretty big island. It sits right south of the United States. It's long, stretches across a big chunk of the Caribbean. It's got a U.S. naval base there, Guantanamo, which has been kind of the base without a country, so to speak, for a very long time. Certainly, it was something that had been there forever, but certainly under Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, his brother. It's been a base that is completely cut off from everything else around it. But we do have a military presence in there, and we have effectively blockaded, since taking control of Venezuela or Venezuela's oil. We have cut off the oil pipeline. Some would say the oil lifeline to Cuba. And so Cuba's running out of oil. Cuba's running out of energy. They can only keep their power on a few hours every day. There's huge problems in terms of basic services, food. There's stories of sewage running in the streets because they can't treat the sewage. They don't have the power to run the sewage treatment facilities. They don't have the power to run the water treatment plants. So you have water issues. They've got epidemics. I haven't heard cholera mentioned yet, but I think at the rate they're going to have a cholera epidemic at some point here. And beyond basically shutting down the Cuban economy for the most part, the U.S. also has indicted Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's brother. He's 94 years old. They indicted him for murder. And that was with a U.S.-run humanitarian flights that were off the coast of Cuba. They, on the order of Raul Castro back in 96, they were, a couple of planes were shot down, 4 Americans were killed, and 3 Americans, 1 green card holder were killed. And they were indicted, and he's been indicted for murder, which is significant when you consider what we just did to Maduro, which was he was indicted in U.S. federal courts, and we went in and literally took him in a very amazing raid. And of course, the fear that the Cubans have is that we'll try and do something with 94-year-old Raul Castro. I don't know if we are, but I think just having that indictment and holding that prospect out that the U.S. might or could certainly puts a lot of pressure on the government of Cuba. Now, President Trump said that the U.S. should run Cuba the same way that it runs Venezuela for the most part. Obviously, the Cuban president, Canal Diaz, is having significant problems with our rhetoric. His foreign minister and his deputy foreign minister have been very vocal, very angry about what the U.S. is doing. And of course, obviously the concern for everybody in his regime is the country is just basically grinding to a stop, economically speaking. At some point, the basic levers of government or being able to govern will stop functioning if they just don't have oil, if they don't have what they need to do it. And it's certainly going to get worse with food shortages and everything else going on. So they're looking at this as kind of an existential event in terms of what's going on there. Now, unlike Venezuela, there aren't the institutional differences within the government that the U.S. could kind of exploit like we did. I won't get into all the details on that, but there really isn't those institutional differences or organizational. There's a lot of cohesion. I mean, they've been there since 1959. It is an authoritarian, communist-controlled system. And so basically the government kind of works together very well across different parts of the government stuff. So they do work. So that's very difficult to exploit that. However, it is very difficult to see how the Cuban government's going to move forward. You know, it's very difficult to see how the Cuban government, based on what they are, how they identify themselves, their ideology, everything else, how they can kind of surrender to U.S. control. But then again, we kind of probably saw that a little bit with the Venezuelan government. But Cuba is much more ensconced into this system than Venezuela ever was. And so it is difficult to see how that would actually happen. But we'll see as things progress. I mean, as the economy gets worse, people are already out in the streets at night banging on pans and stuff in frustration. And it's difficult to do any polling of any sort in Cuba, but it looks like about 70 to 80% of the population is just absolutely fed up with the regime, fed up with the government, and they want to move forward. And some of them are actually speaking out publicly when they talk to journalists or others. They'll say, we wish the U.S. would just come in militarily, get it all done with, and so we can get back to living. So rather interesting what's happening in Cuba. If Cuba topples, that is the base. That was the base for the Soviet Union in the Western Hemisphere. That is the base for Russia and particularly China. That's where they can operate most freely. They have very large intelligence collection capabilities there, big signals intelligence capabilities there. This is their platform for exporting influence and espionage and everything else throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. Cuba is the linchpin. That is their center of gravity. If Cuba goes, they no longer have that center of gravity. They no longer have that base. So this is something that we have to watch very closely. Now, in South America, a number of countries, Colombia had an election, and they elected a socialist government that was really against the U.S. You probably remember Morales in Bolivia, staunch anti-American, hatred of America, socialist, and I have been engaged with some stuff with Bolivia. We were looking some years back at the U.S. going in there and helping to deal with the lithium mining, basically extracting lithium out of Bolivia. They have I think the largest known reserves of lithium on the planet. But under the Morales government, it's so ineptly managed by the governmental level. It was always the largest reserves ever, and it may always be the largest reserves ever because they never seem to be able to get their act together. So, but that government is now switched, and it is making overtures to the U.S. Well, Ecuador, which has kind of gone back and forth over the many years, Ecuador's government invited the U.S. to come in and says, hey, can you help us deal with the cartel-affiliated gangs? And the U.S. has. And the U.S., by all reports, has been down there doing a lot of things, a lot of helicopter operations, a lot of other things. Special forces or special operations forces working in Ecuador, doing coordinated operations targeting these groups that are designated terrorist organizations by the U.S., with another way of saying drug cartels and gangs associated with drug cartels. And this has marked the first time that U.S. forces have been participated in land operations inside Ecuador as part of the administration's anti-drug campaign. All right. It involves Ecuadorian special operations forces along with our stuff, but raiding drug facilities, going after in multiple provinces. The U.S. special forces are essentially providing advisory support, intelligence support, operational planning, logistics support. There was helicopter supported strikes throughout the country. And this has really been seen as a, quote, new phase, unquote, of the joint fight against narco-terrorism. And they throw in the words illegal mining, which I find interesting. And there is a lot of illegal mining in Ecuador. In fact, that whole region, there's a bunch of illegal mining. So I just found that kind of interesting that some of this is aimed at going after that illegal mining side too, which is also these criminal organizations. So anyway, Ecuador's president, Daniel Noboa, in his State of the Union address, which was not that long ago, basically emphasized his administration's crime-fighting strategies, but emphasized the fact that they're staunchly supported by the United States. To see that in Ecuador, with some of the stuff that's been coming out of that region over the many years, that is a huge shift towards working with the U.S. on a common goal, in this case, going after the drug cartels. And that is something that I think we cannot understate, is what a shift that is. And obviously the whole thing is we are shifting more attention down south than we have in decades. And that's just part of this overall thing. Now, in Mexico, big shift going on there. And you may remember that when Trump came into office this last time, he was talking about we may start doing military strikes or something down in Mexico. And of course, President Sheinbaum and others turned around and said, that's a violation of our sovereignty. And certainly there was a lot of back and forth. Tensions really high. Tariffs were being imposed and all sorts of things. Anyway, long story short, things have changed. 2 U.S. officials, reportedly CIA, died in a vehicle ambush that took place down there, but it brought to the attention just the extent by which the U.S. is operating throughout Mexico, working with certain parts of the Mexican government security apparatus, going after these cartels. And, Mexico has complained loudly about potential violation of sovereignty, but behind the scenes, they have the U.S. apparently doing a lot. Now, this is causing a lot of political tension, obviously within the Mexican government. It's like, what is the CIA doing down here? What are we allowing the CIA to do down here? But, there's been reports for going back a very long time, many, many, many months, early last year, that U.S. intelligence flights, both manned and unmanned, were going over Mexico on a regular basis, looking at the cartels. And DEA has always had a very strong presence down in Mexico, but I would also reference the fact it's a foreign country. So that's someplace that the CIA would obviously operate as well. And based on the latest, they are very much operating there. So in short, it seems that a very mutually agreeable situation has occurred with the Mexican government that allows the U.S. to do a lot more to aggressively go after these cartels. And, and it's got to be very well controlled by the U.S. One of the problems with Mexico is because of the cartels' funding, because of their influence, they are able to, and it's not because, say, oh, there's corruption in the Mexican government. The problem is when the cartel comes in, they give you a choice, as they'll say silver or lead, which is, you can either take our money or we will go and kill you and your family. And so they get people to work with them, and they are a very pervasive, corrosive influence across government in Mexico, particularly at the states, but also at the federal level. It has been a big, big challenge to deal with this. So there are certain things that are kind of walled off within the Mexican security apparatus, like the Marines down there, that do a lot of the counter-cartel enforcement, counter-cartel operations, because of the way that they've kind of made them impossible to identify, so the cartels can't go in, at least have a very difficult time going in, try to figure out who they are so they can do stuff with them. Now, years back, there was a lot of discussion about these intelligence fusion centers that were set up in Mexico with U.S. help. Everything I heard about that is it didn't quite work the way we'd hoped, because when there was information sharing or intelligence sharing, I think there was a feeling that a lot of that intelligence was going to places that we didn't want it to go, possibly to the cartels themselves. So I never got the sense that really worked out as well. I'd heard that there was even, you go down there and you'd see like a U.S. side and a Mexican side almost working parallel, but not in concert with each other. So that's all stuff that I'd heard. I don't know if it's absolutely true. I wasn't working in those fusion centers. Obviously, I've done a lot of work with the fusion center program, both in the U.S. and overseas, but that's kind of what was coming out of that. So there were some real problems systemically with what we were doing in Mexico, going after the cartels. And so it's always been a challenge with the U.S. and with Mexico, how to deal with the cartels because of what's going on. Now, I would mention that you may have seen in the news that just, I think about a day or two ago, that the Mexico arrested the nephew of El Chapo Guzman, his nephew, in an operation down there. That was just a couple of days ago that occurred. And that falls on last month. The Mexican military captured 3 associates of El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel. And so that's, and his a brother in an operation backed by U.S. intelligence. All right. Meanwhile, the U.S. has indicted 10 current and former Mexican officials, government officials. Namely, the big one was the governor of Sinaloa province. As you recall, El Chapo, Sinaloa cartel. Anyway, and this has caused some serious political angst within Mexico, as you can well imagine, when a governor has been indicted by the United States. So there's just a lot of stuff that's going on. Now, you may recall back in February, El Mencho, which was head of the New Generation Cartel, CGNG, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, was killed in a raid. And all of this is just a way of saying there is a lot going on in Mexico with the U.S. working with Mexican security forces going after the cartels. Guatemala just recently just announced that they've agreed to joint strikes with U.S. military forces inside its territory to target drug trafficking groups. They've asked for greater aid from the United States in going after these drug cartels. And that's a significant escalation in our presence in Guatemala. I spent some time in Guatemala back in the early 90s. It's kind of a place that's near and dear. I like Guatemala. And I'm glad to see the U.S. in there dealing with the growing cartel presence that has been happening in Guatemala, Honduras, and some of these other countries. The list goes on and on. The U.S. is engaging in a far greater level in Central and South America, in the Caribbean than ever before. Much of this tied to Operation Southern Spear. Of course, the part we see of Southern Spear is every time that they do a strike on a drug boat, either a fast boat or a semi-submersible that's moving in the Eastern Pacific or through the Caribbean, we basically hit them kinetically once we've identified them as a narco-terrorist boat. That's what gets all the headlines. But behind the scenes is this level of cooperation that's happening on the security side. Now, with that level of cooperation, there is a shift politically, a shift that has opened up opportunities for the U.S. to go to some of these countries. Some of these countries, I think the U.S., like Bolivia, I can tell you that I know a number of folks in business that kind of wrote off Bolivia. They just gave up on them because the government and Morales, or the Morales associate government, they just got tired of it. And there's a number of countries down there that were difficult for the U.S. companies to do business in. I think that's going to change. I think it's going to shift in mining. I know it's happening right now in mining. I think it's going to shift in a major way with oil across the board. And if you look at what's going on in Venezuela, but if you look right next door to what's happening in Guyana, you see that. By the way, I would also mention that Cuba has some oil fields that have not been exploited. I would imagine maybe a year or two from now, we may be seeing some headlines, depending on what happens in Cuba, that the U.S. is in there trying to work with them on those oil fields. So I think a lot is going to change across the board. And it's not just raw resources. I think it's going to happen in all sectors. I think it's going to happen in industry, manufacturing. I think you're going to see some high-tech stuff going down there that wasn't there before. I think you're going to see a lot of different things. Obviously, agriculture is huge. I see shifts in agriculture going on there and ag business. So a lot of things that go on there. And a lot of this is filling what I think is going to be a little bit, the Chinese influence is shifting in the hemisphere. And that's one of the reasons that you see the U.S. having such a concerted action in Ecuador, because China basically has built this massive port complex down in that area. And you see us looking at this going, we have to reassert ourselves because Chinese influence is becoming much more pervasive. I'm not saying that China is going to be gone, but I do see us taking a new role in trying to diminish and offset Chinese influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. And that's going to create new opportunities for business in a variety of roles. Thanks for listening to Strat. Also go to stratpodcast.com. You can also go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV. Also my website, corporate website, www.gripsa.com. And then if you want to catch the latest global threat update, we have one coming up in June. And you can go to the LosAngeles.org website and register for that. So anyway, thanks for listening. And by the way, if anybody wants to sponsor Strat, please give us a call. Send us an email. We'd love to have more sponsors. Thank you.